Week 12 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few kickers. I would start this week. The first kicker, Jason Myers of the Seattle Seahawks. It's been a solid season for Myers in the last 2 weeks. He's had 12 or more fantasy points as Jason Myers in the last 4 out of 5 weeks. Double-digit fantasy games. Week 6 at Jacksonville, 10. Week 7 versus Houston, 10. Week 9 at Washington, 9. Week 10 versus Arizona, 15. And Week 11 at the Rams, 15 fantasy points. So this week, a good matchup at Tennessee. We know their defense is bend but don't break at times. Give up the 14th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And Jason Myers, I know he missed the game winner, but that was long out there in that ball game in Los Angeles. But like I said, he's still putting points on the board. He's got a big boot. He's in a pretty solid offense, and this week in a good matchup at the Titans, he's a start. Next kicker, Tyler Loop of the Baltimore Ravens. It's been a solid rookie season, in my opinion, for Tyler Loop, and he's filled in pretty well now for, obviously, Justin Tucker, who's out of the league. So last 3 out of 4 weeks, double-digit fantasy points for Tyler Loop. This Raven offense getting back to the powerhouse offense they are. And this week, it's a slam dunk matchup versus the Jets that give up the most fantasy points to kickers on the season. Week 8 versus the Bears, 13. Week 9 at Miami, 4. Week 10 at Minnesota, 14. And Week 11 at the Browns, 12. So like I said, he's putting up double digits. He's showing off the distance, 50-plus yards. Hasn't been a problem for Tyler Loop. And this week in a matchup, like I said, versus the Jets, most points to kickers on the season. He's an easy start this week. The next kicker, Jake Elliott of the Philadelphia Eagles. Elliott, he had his best game of the season last week in the victory versus the Detroit Lions. And this week, it's a good matchup at the Dallas Cowboys, a defense that can't stop anyone. They give up the 8th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And Elliott, he's had a good track record within the division in the NFC East throughout his NFL career. And going back early in the season in Week 1, he did have 8 fantasy points versus Cowboy defense. Week 8 versus the Giants, 9. Week 10 at Green Bay, 4. Week 11 versus Detroit, 11. So like I said, this week a good matchup at Dallas, even though Dallas definitely improved this defense, adding Quinnen Williams to the trade deadline, adding Logan Wilson at the deadline as well. Overshown back in the lineup, Malik Hooker. So they've definitely got some reinforcements in this defense. But I think indoor game in Dallas, Jake Elliott, he's going to put points on the board, and he's a start this week. The next start, Cairo Santos of the Chicago Bears. So Cairo Santos, he's on a high-powered offense. He's putting up fantasy points. And the last 3 out of 4 weeks as well for Cairo Santos, he's putting up double-digit fantasy points. So this week, a good matchup versus bend but don't break defense of the Pittsburgh Steelers that give up the 2nd most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So the last few games here for Santos, Week 8 at Baltimore, 11. Week 9 at Cincinnati, 10. Week 10 versus Giants, 6. And Week 11, including the game-winning field goal from 48 yards at the Minnesota Vikings, 15 fantasy points. So this week, like I said, it is in Soldier Field, tough place to kick, but Cairo Santos is a veteran. He's been one of the more consistent kickers, believe it or not, over the last 4 or 5 seasons in the NFL. And like I said, in a high-powered offense led by the Ben Johnson coached Chicago Bears. I think he'd go out there once again this week versus a good Steeler defense and put up some numbers. And the final kicker, Jake Bates of the Detroit Lions. So Jake Bates, we know he's got a big boot. Last week, he kicked a deep 54-yarder in a heavy-winded ball game on Sunday Night Football at Philadelphia. So Bates has the distance, and anytime you're in a high-powered offense, opportunities are going to be there. Even I know the numbers haven't been great this season for Bates, where it's a lot of extra points he's getting, but at times as well, deep 50-plus yardage are going to be out there for him. Week 9 versus Minnesota, 6. Week 10 at Washington, 11. And Week 11 at Philadelphia in that ball game, he had 4 fantasy points. He missed an extra point in that one. So this week here, a great matchup versus the Giants. They give up the 7th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. Detroit, we know their offense in terms of putting up fantasy numbers is better at home than it is on the road. And Jake Bates, he has a big boot. And this week, you don't have to deal with outside elements. So with all those factors and the great matchup, he's definitely a kicker to start this week. So that's a few kickers I would start for Week 12 of the fantasy football season.